Hi everyone, trust you all are doing well. Welcome to our next lesson. And in this lesson, we'll be learning about functions in JavaScript. Very, very exciting stuff. Right. So the first thing that we normally do, like every video, is we create a new file. And this one, we call it 07functions.js. All right. So you create that file. And then you obviously link it with our lovely defer method. And yes, and after you've done that, we open that file. And I'm just console logging it to see if it's working. All right, as you can see in the console, it gives us that it is working. So all good, so all linked up, everything ready to go. All right, so another essential concept in coding is functions, which allow you or me to store a piece of code that does a single task inside a block. And then call that code whenever we need to use it with a simple, short command, rather than we have to type out the whole code over and over again. All right. So we've been using functions throughout the course already, like the built-in function. If you guys remember, we had the join method, the join one, right, where we had the string.join. The other one that we had was in the previous episode was the array one. We had the push, let's say tools.push. So these are some of the built-in functions that we have in JavaScript. All right. The JavaScript language basically has many built-in browser functions to allow us to do useful things without having to write all the code ourselves, which is very nice. In fact, some of the code that we are calling when we invoke a fancy word for actually running or executing the code, built into the browser function, couldn't be written actually in JavaScript. Many of these functions that we are calling are part of the background code of the browser, which are largely written in low-level language like C++ and not a web language like JavaScript. Sorry for the tongue twister there. All right, but bear in mind that some of the built-in functions in the browsers are not part of the core JavaScript language. Some are defined as part of the browser's API. Okay. Now, before we type anything, we're just doing theory at the moment. All right. Functions that are part of object are considered in programming as methods. All right. So we're not going to be learning about objects in JavaScript yet, because we're going to get to that when we do the object programming part of this course. But we're not going to be dealing with it now. But just remember, there's a fine line between functions and methods. All right. So let's move on. To actually use a function, after it has been defined, we have to run or basically invoke the code. This can be done by including the function in the code somewhere followed by parentheses. All right. Now you might be wondering, okay, how do we do this? In order to declare a function, we use the function keyword. Function. All right. Then we have open and closing curly braces. All right. Now in this case, this is just an anonymous function, but we're not going to be discussing anonymous functions yet. We're just going to get to that in a sec. So let's create a named function. So I'm just going to call this one sum function. All right. So we have our open and closing brackets, and we're just going to console.log this to the, let's say, sum code. Just as an example, sum code. All right. Now, in order to execute this function, or basically invoke or run this function, we need to say, call the function, like with open and closing parentheses, like this. All right. So that is basically invoking or running the function. As you can see, it runs some code for us in the browser. Very, very, very cool. All right. So this is a named function. Okay. And the next one that we have is called anonymous functions. All right. So let's just comment this part out because we don't need that. All right. So anonymous function basically is like this, like I've mentioned before, is that basically it doesn't have a name. All right. So in this case, we're just going to say prompt, not like that. All right. And we're going to say enter correct email, just as an example. Okay. But now the thing is, you will see we get some errors because we don't normally use anonymous functions like this. Anonymous. All right, anonymous function. All right, we don't normally call it like this. All right, now the correct way to do it is we normally use anonymous function along with an event handler. One out. We're going to use that in a second. In our index.html, I just created a button that says click me. All right, very, very professional, A-grade kind of example. All right, so let me just do this. All right, so let's create a const keyword, and we're going to call this variable button. And then we're going to do document.query selector. All right, and then we're going to check for that button that we just created. All right, and we found it. Let's console log just to make sure we have it. As you can see, we got the button right there. Very, very nice. Okay, let's just close it off. Right, don't worry about the error right there. It's just some of the stuff are deprecated. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to put an event handler on that button. And what event we're going to do is we're going to listen for the on-click event, because this is basically a global event. Right, so on the on-clicked, we're basically going to equal that. Right, and we're just going to equal that to the anonymous function that we just created. All right, open and closing parentheses, and just like this. And then we're going to create a prompt. And in this, we're just going to say enter correct email, please. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now, the thing is, this function, as soon as we click the button, it needs to call this anonymous function for us. So let's see if it's working. Okay, so we press the click me button. As you can see, enter the correct email, please. But we normally don't use prompt or lists in our web development. As you can see, the styling and things don't look that nice as well. We normally have different things to handle that, but this is just for an example. All right. And another thing that you can do is you can assign a variable basically to a function. Basically, we can do this instead of the button. We can say const button event. I'm just making an example. Is equal to that. All right. And then we can obviously call the button event like this. So button event. Right, so let's do that. As you can see, it called the button right there. But now the problem that you might ask, but why would we want to do that? And I will tell you, I agree with you. The best way to do this, if you want to assign a variable to anonymous function. Best practice is to rather use named functions. Okay, so instead of doing this, rather do named functions like function dot button click or something, whatever you want, but rather do a named function. Okay, that is better, a best practice compared to assigning it to an anonymous function to a variable. Okay, right, let's move on. Now with functions, let me just comment this out. With functions, some require parameters in order to be specified when you are invoking them. These are values that need to be included inside the function's parentheses. All right, now let's just quickly do this. Parameters. Now let's say we have a function. As an example, a function, some function. Okay, very original function. We have a value. Okay, so we got a sum function and we have a value. Now the thing is, this value is now a parameter. Okay, now sometimes they are called parameters, arguments, properties, or attributes. But in this course, we're going to just call them parameters. Okay, so this is the parameter. So if I console.log the value, okay, that we have right there, and we invoke the function. Okay, now the thing is, if we invoke it like this, you're going to see what happens in the browser. The browser is going to tell us like, listen, this thing is undefined. Why? Because we didn't define the value. Okay, so how do we do that? We just, when we invoke the function, we just add the value. In our case, 120, as you can see, it returns the value of 120 when we invoke the function. Very, very cool. Now, we have been dealing actually with some built-in functions that have certain parameters. If you guys remember, let's create an example. We had dealt with the replace method. So let's create let text equal to some text. Just an example. All right. And let new text equal to text dot replace. You remember this? Now the replace takes two parameters. It takes the substring that we want to find, and we take the substring and another substring of the text that we want to replace. So basically the first one, in this case we want sum, and we want to replace it with awesome. Okay. So remember, this is like the built-in function that requires two parameters. All right. And if we console.log the new text, okay, you will see it replaced the sum with awesome because it required two parameters and give us back a new value of awesome text. So this is some of the built-in parameters that you'll have in some of the functions in the browsers. Okay. It should also be noted that sometimes the parameters are optional. You don't have to specify it. If you don't, the function will generally adopt some kind of default behavior. Now, in our case up here is, it will actually just set the value to undefined if we don't specify a value here. Okay, so let's uncomment this. So basically, if we don't add a value, the default value that it assigned to it is basically undefined, which is actually a value on its own, but it's undefined value. Kind of mind-boggling, but yes. All right. So if we add 120, it obviously assigns the value, but if we don't add something, it will actually give us the value of undefined. All right, so let's uncomment. comment this out so we don't, and we actually can remove the button now. Let me just do that. And let's give us some space to work with. Nice. Okay. The next thing that we're going to deal with is scopes in JavaScript. All right. Do this. Scopes. We have a global scope and a local scope in coding. Right. So now let's say this is our code. All right. Let's quickly create a function first. Let's say a function, a named function. Let's call it some function again. Very original, I know. Some function. All right. Now, when you create a function, the variables and other things defined inside this function. Now let's create a variable called first name equals to John. Okay. Now the variables and things defined inside this function have their own separate scope, meaning these are locked away in their own separate compartment, unreachable from the code from the outside. Very, very useful. All right. Now, the top level outside of this function is called the global scope. So if we define a function, right, a variable right here. So let's say we declare last name. We equal that to Doe. All right. So this is on our global scope, meaning this variable can be accessed from anywhere inside our code. Okay. And this is the local scope. So this one right here is the global scope. This right here is the local scope. Right? All right. Now the reason why we have different scope in JavaScript is for security, but actually this is actually in programming in general. All right. The reason why we have different scopes is for security and organizing your code. All right. Sometimes you don't want other variables to be accessible from anywhere in the code. Okay. Especially, let's say you got an external code from somewhere that more or less have the same variable name. Okay, like say first name. Right. This can either be intentional or accidental. Let's say some user with malicious intent create some nice software. As you know, it's the web nowadays are very dangerous. Create some malicious code and you can access your functions or your things from the outside because they're globally available. Then it can actually do some serious harm to your code. Okay, just a point to remember. Okay, if you intend only create variables globally, if you intend to create them globally, otherwise create them in the local scope. Okay, but only do that if you intend to. Okay, all right, because then you can work around it in a certain way. But all right, let's move on to the next one. So this is our global scope and local scope. There's obviously more to discuss on the different topic, because there's some very useful information out there. If you just Google global scope versus local scope, then there's a lot of articles about the two, and you can just expand your knowledge like that. Okay. All right, the next one we're going to discuss is functions inside other functions. Right? Remember that we can call functions from anywhere, even inside another function. This is often used as a way to keep our code tidy. Now let's create an example. I'm just quickly going to type it out. Let's say we got our function, and this is going to be a big function. Right, we have a big function right there. And inside this function, we're going to create a value, a variable called some value. Very original, I know, of, let's say, 40. All right. Now, we're going to call a small function 1. Right, we're going to call that, and with some value. All right. And then we're going to call a small function 2, also with some value. Okay, so we got two smaller functions that is called inside a big function. So how do we do this now? Now we're going to create the small function, function 1. All right, we're going to assign a variable called value, a parameter, and inside that we're just going to console.log. Let's do this. We're going to console log the value times the value. Very original on that. All right, so that's the first one. Let me just call this one 1. And let's call this one number 2. Instead of multiplying the value, we're just going to add the value. All right, so in order to invoke the big function, let's quickly do it. So the big function, we're going to invoke it. And then we're going to add the value 2. Okay, but already we got the constant right there. So there's no need to actually add it. We just called it up. All right, so 40 times 40 is 1600. And 40 plus 40 gives us 80. All right, so we know that this one is a small function. That's why the multiply one is called there. And the small function is right there. Very, very neat. Handy. And we can even do this, like we remember from the previous one. We're just going to add some value. All right, so we can do it. And it's just going to return not a number. NaN stands for not a number. And we're just going to do 40. Now, as you can see, it returns us the value right there. Okay, so we add the parameter and we just add the parameter. So if we add 2 there, you can see, let's just see. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. Very cool. 8, 64, and 16. Great stuff. All right. Now, another thing that you can do in JavaScript is called arrow functions. Okay, so let's move on. Let's just comment this one out. The next thing that we have in JavaScript is arrow function. We're not going to go into detail with arrow function. There's obviously a lot of information about arrow functions, but we're just going to give you guys just the bare basics about arrow functions or expressions. All right. So a traditional function like we just created looks like this. We've got a function with a, let's just create an anonymous function first. We're obviously going to get the error. So console.log traditional. Okay, let's do this. All right, so we're always going to get an error because we know how to invoke, how to use anonymous functions. All right, but don't worry about that. And the arrow function will basically do the same thing. Instead of that, let me just add a value. Value right here. And we can say traditional plus the value. Okay, let's do it like this. And with an arrow function, we're just going to do the open and closing. We add the arrow. Then we open and close it. And inside here, we obviously add the value. All right. So basically, that's more or less, and we can just obviously add the same thing right here. All right, but we're obviously having an error, but you will understand why, because we haven't given it any name yet. All right, so let's just comment this. All right, as you can see, this one won't give us an error. Now, the thing is, there's certain differences and, let's say, limitations when it comes to arrow functions. Now, let me quickly type them out for you. Okay, so I'll just speed up the video for you. All right, now the difference and limitations. It does not have its own bindings to the this or super keyword and should not be used as methods. Does not have arguments or new.target keywords. Not suitable for call, apply, and bind methods. Cannot be used as constructors and cannot yield within its body. Now, some of these things are not within the scope of this course yet, but just copy them down and remember them, because you're going to hear these things come up a little bit later in this course as well, so then you can remember them. Okay, so this is just for memory and reference. All right, let's move on. All right, named arrow functions. Now, if we have a function like this, the traditional function called sum function. Okay, let me just make sure I didn't create it before. Yes, I commented out. Sum function, not curly braces, and console.log, just something. Okay. All right. So this is our traditional name function, and if we want to return it, we can just invoke it like this. Okay, so we know how that works now. Okay, very cool. Proud of you guys. Proud of you guys. Okay, so this is our traditional. Okay, and this is our arrow. Okay, and let me just type it out. Expression. All right, now in the arrow expression, how do we do this? Now, in arrow functions, the named functions we had, we treat the arrow expression like a variable. So how do we do that? So let's create a constant keyword with sum function. Equal that to like this, and voila. Voila, and we can do this console.log, and we can log in something. I think we might get an error. Yes, we get an error because this is already declared up here. Let's just uncomment that. And let's see, some function. I think I might have made a mistake. Nope, I didn't. And there it is right there. Okay, and it returns the value. So basically you assign it to a const or let keyword. In my case, I prefer the const keyword. All right, so we got our constant there. We have our equal operator that we assign to open and curly braces, and assign the arrow, and yes. Okay, now what if, like in this case up here, what if we had a value? Just a variable. Let's do value. Okay, so in this case we had a value, and just create this like this. Okay, so we had a value right there, and then we assign the value plus value. Okay, we did that before. Now, how do we do this in arrow functions? We can obviously just assign the value right there, and we can just say plus value. Now let's just add some space, open and closing, and just concatenate the value attached. All right, so it obviously gives us undefined because we haven't defined it here. So let's define it. Let's say 20. So something 20. All right, so we can obviously have this. We can have an arrow expression without a parameter, and we can obviously have it with a parameter where we just add the parameter in there. Value. Okay, but if it's a single parameter, it's fine. Let me just do this. Comment this. We can have also another variable. Let's say a, just in there, and then we can add plus value plus a. Okay, so when we add multiple parameters, we can just say 2 and 4. Right? As you can see, something 24. Now the thing is, if you have a single value, it will actually work without the parentheses. So we can just say value, and let's just remove this. Just like this. All right. As you can see, it also works without the parentheses. But just remember, you can add them. Looks quite cool. I like the arrow functions actually to use them. All right. So that is enough. That's why I said I don't want to. There's actually a whole topic about arrow functions that we can get into, but I just wanted to get you guys to just the basic stuff, just to get by, because it's a lot of information. You're not going to become experts overnight. Like some videos say, you can learn JavaScript in 5 minutes. I want to see that. Thank you, guys. All right, let's move on. Let's go comment that one out so it doesn't give us any more errors. Okay, let's move on. Now, just remember, just a special note. If you guys are using Internet Explorer, because I've seen some people still use Internet Explorer in 2021, please, please, please. Arrow functions are not supported in Internet Explorer. Okay, so please consider upgrading to either Chrome, Firefox, Edge, or Safari, or Opera. Okay. All right, let's move on. All right, now the next thing that we want to do is what if we want to return a value? All right, let's say what if we want to return? Some functions don't return a significant value, but others do. It is important to understand what their values are, how to use them in your code, and how to make a function return some useful values. So, how can we return a value? So let's create a function again. I want us to get so used to, after I'm finished, in order to type a function. Okay, so that is our function. Now, we're going to add a parameter of, let's say, num. Okay, so we want a parameter or value, or num, argument, or an attribute. Okay, so in order to do that, we just type in return. In our case, we want to say return num times num. Whatever the number is, return num plus 1. Num times num, because we want to calculate, let's say, some function. Just do some function and 2. That's what we want to do. But you know what? Instead of doing this, let's go to our some function. Now, as you can see, it gives us not a number because it requires a number. So let's say 5. So as you can see, 5 times 5 is 25. So it returns that value. And 6 times 6 gives us 36. So basically, this function return. So what if we do minus a number? Well, it will give us 0. All right. So to the exponent of that number. Let's see. Some function. And if we add 2, give us 4. And if we give 9, 8, 6, 4, 2 is 4, 4, 2, 5, 6. As you can see, very, very cool. All right. So that is enough for us about this lesson. Thank you guys for watching. Really appreciate you being here. It's almost past 34 minutes already. Thank you for watching, and please, if you like the video, give it a like. If you don't like it, please give it a dislike. Give us some constructive feedback. And yes, there's some useful resources under the Mozilla Foundation regarding this topic on arrow functions. Just in the search bar, just type in arrow functions or arrow expressions. They will be able to just give you a little bit more detail on it. Or you can use DoubleTree Schools. I found there's a little bit not so well explained compared to Mozilla Foundations. All right. Thank you guys. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.